The auction sign had been nailed to a rotting fence post for 3 weeks before Alice Slater finally worked up the nerve to ride out and look at the land. And what she found there stopped her breath in a way that had nothing to do with the August heat pressing down on the Kansas plains like a hot iron on cotton. It was 1878, and the territory of Kansas had seen better days and worse ones, and the Holt homestead, what was left of it, sat at the edge of a shallow creek called Widow's Run about 4 miles southeast of the town of Caldwell. The main house had half its roof caved in from a winter storm nobody had bothered to repair. The barn leaned so far to one side that it looked like a drunk man trying to find his way home. The well was dry and filled with debris, and the fields hadn't been turned in 2 seasons, so the earth had grown over with switchgrass and buffalo clover, and the particular kind of stubborn weeds that seemed to grow nowhere else, but on land that had given up on people. Alice stood in the middle of it all with the Kansas wind pulling strands of chestnut hair loose from the braid she'd pinned under her hat, and she looked at the ruined place, and she smiled. She was 26 years old, which in 1878 Caldwell meant that more than a few people considered her shelf-worn. She had come west from Cincinnati 3 years ago with her mother, who had since died of a fever that took her quickly and without much ceremony, the way fevers did in those days. She had been working since then at the Caldwell Mercantile, keeping the accounts for a man named Virgil Prout who paid her fairly, but who also never let her forget that he was doing her a kindness by employing a woman for such work. She lived in 2 rented rooms above the hardware store, and she had saved every dollar she could set aside, and now she had $412 in a tin box under her floorboard, and she had looked at that money every night for 6 months trying to decide what it wanted to be. Standing in the ruin of the Holt place, surrounded by the smell of dry grass and old wood and the distant sweetness of the creek, she understood what it wanted to be. She wanted land of her own. Not land that belonged to a husband who might treat her well or might not. Not land that a father or brother managed while she kept the house. Her own land, where the decisions and the failures and the triumphs would all belong to her. It was an ambition that made the women of Caldwell nervous and the men of Caldwell amused, and both of those reactions had settled something cold and determined in Alice's chest that she carried with her everywhere she went. The auction was set for the following Saturday morning, the 1st of September, at 9 o'clock sharp in front of the Caldwell courthouse. The land included 80 acres, the creek frontage, the ruined structures, and whatever livestock remained, which turned out to be 2 elderly goats that had been living in the collapsed barn and a dog of uncertain parentage who had set himself up as the property's unofficial caretaker. Alice arrived at the courthouse at 10 minutes before 9, wearing her best blue dress and her mother's cameo brooch pinned at her collar. She had her $400 in an envelope in her reticule, which she gripped with both hands. She had left $12 in the tin box, because she was practical even when she was brave. The county land agent, a wide man named Gerald Fitch who wore his belt under his belly rather than over it, stood on the courthouse steps with a sheaf of papers and a look on his face that communicated deep personal suffering at having to be awake this early on a Saturday. A handful of men from town had gathered, the way men gathered at any public event that might produce something interesting to discuss afterward. There was Harlan Webb, who owned the feed store and had buying eyes on most of the available land south of town. There was Tom Purvis, a rancher who grazed cattle north of the creek. There were several others Alice recognized, and a few she did not. What there was not, as Gerald Fitch began his preamble about terms and conditions, was any serious bidding. Harlan Webb looked at the survey map Fitch was waving, and said to no one in particular that he'd heard the well had gone completely dead, and the soil in the north field had gone alkaline, and that assessment rippled through the small crowd and seemed to settle the matter before it had even begun. Tom Purvis studied the map for a long moment, and then folded his arms and said the creek frontage would be worth something if it weren't for the spring flooding that had been running across the South Quarter for the past 5 years. The other men nodded at each other with the satisfied expressions of people who have found a good reason not to spend money. Gerald Fitch looked up from his papers and asked if there were any opening bids on the property described as the former Holt Homestead, 80 acres with water access and existing structures. Alice Slater raised her hand and said, $250. The quiet that followed was the kind that had a texture to it. Several of the men turned to look at her, and their faces moved through a sequence of expressions: surprise, amusement, something that on the less charitable ones bordered on contempt. Gerald Fitch blinked. He looked at his papers. He looked at Alice. He asked if there were any other bids. There were not. He waited the required interval. He asked again. He cleared his throat and shifted his weight and looked at Harlan Webb, who shrugged, and looked at Tom Purvis, who had developed a sudden interest in the middle distance. Gerald Fitch said that the property was sold to Miss Alice Slater for $250, and he said it the way a man says something he suspects he will be repeating as a story for many years. Alice paid her money, received her deed, and was standing at the edge of the courthouse steps, folding the document carefully into her reticule when a voice behind her said, "Pardon me, miss." She turned. The man standing there was perhaps 30 or 31, lean and weathered in the way that men who worked outdoors got weathered, with dark hair under a worn hat, and eyes the color of good creek water in late afternoon, somewhere between green and gray depending on the angle. He was not a man she recognized from Caldwell's regular population, though there was something about the set of his shoulders and the direct steadiness of his gaze that made him seem like someone who had been somewhere long enough to know what he thought about it. He held his hat in both hands, which she appreciated as a mark of basic courtesy, and he said, "I don't mean to intrude on your morning, but I couldn't help overhearing the auction, and I find I want to ask you something if you'll allow it." Alice looked at him. "What would you like to ask?" "What do you see in it?" he said. "The Holt place. Everyone else here saw a dead well and flooded fields and a barn that looks like it's apologizing for existing. I watched you out there last Wednesday, walking the property. You were the only one smiling. I'd like to know what you saw that they didn't." Alice was quiet for a moment, studying him. It was not a question she had expected, and it was not the question she would have expected from anyone standing on those courthouse steps that morning. Most of the responses she had received to her interest in the property ranged from skepticism to pity to a kind of condescending bewilderment. No one had asked her what she saw in it. They had all told her what was wrong with it. "You were watching me walk the property?" she asked. He had the decency to look briefly embarrassed. "I was riding past on the Kisham side road. I wasn't watching in any particular manner, I just noticed. Most people don't walk a piece of land like they're trying to remember something." That answer surprised her enough that she answered honestly. "The creek is only dry at the mouth," she said. "If you go back about a quarter-mile upstream, there's a spring coming in from the limestone formation on the east bank. The original Holt well was in the wrong place. The soil in the north field went alkaline because they were flooding it wrong, not because there's anything wrong with the earth itself. The structure of the house is sound except for the roof section, which came down because of a design flaw in the original rafter system, not because the wood is rotted through. The south field gets the flooding because there's a berm of old alluvial deposit blocking the natural drainage. Cut through that in 2 places and the water flows where it ought to." She paused. The man was watching her with an expression she had not seen directed at her in quite some time, which was the expression of someone who was genuinely paying attention. "I saw 80 acres that other people gave up on because they didn't look closely enough," she said. "I tend to look closely at things." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Yes, I believe you do." "You still haven't told me who you are," Alice said. He put his hat back on his head and said, "Albert Underwood. I'm currently employed as a hand over at the Meridian Ranch, about 6 miles north. Before that I was in Colorado, and before that Missouri, and before that a few other places that didn't hold me. I've been in Caldwell about 2 months." "Alice Slater," she said, though he had clearly heard her name from the auction. "And I have been in Caldwell 3 years, and now I own 80 acres on Widow's Run, and I have exactly $162 left to my name." Albert Underwood looked at her for a moment, and then he smiled, and the smile was a real one, not the polite kind or the patronizing kind, but the kind that reached all the way to those creekwater eyes and stayed there. "That sounds like the beginning of something," he said. "It is," said Alice Slater. "It's the beginning of everything." She rode back out to her land that afternoon. She had arranged with Virgil Prout to continue working at the mercantile until she had enough saved to hire whatever labor she could not do herself, and she had already made a list in the small leather notebook she carried, organized by priority and estimated cost, because Alice Slater did nothing without a list. First, the well. Second, the roof. Third, the drainage berm. Fourth, the fences. Fifth, everything else which was considerable. The dog was there when she arrived, sitting in the shade of what had once been a porch, watching her with the dignified patience of a creature who had been waiting for the right person to show up and was now prepared to offer his professional opinion on their qualifications. He was brown and white with one ear that stood up and one that didn't, and he was large enough to be useful and small enough to not be alarming, and Alice decided on the spot that his name was Commissioner, because he had clearly been overseeing the place in the absence of any proper management. She walked every inch of the 80 acres again, this time with her notebook, making observations and measurements she would later transfer to a rough map. The two goats observed her from a distance with the mild suspicion that goats reserve for all human activity. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon when she finally sat down on the remains of the porch steps with Commissioner pressed against her knee, and she looked out at the switchgrass moving in the evening wind and the long flat line of the plains going golden in the last light, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular peace of being exactly where you are supposed to be. She was back in town by dark, which was later than she should have been out riding alone, and she knew it, and she didn't much care. The plains south of Caldwell were not without their dangers in 1878. There were still cattle drives coming up the Kisham Trail that brought men of varying character, and the border country between Kansas and the territory to the south was unsettled in ways that occasionally made themselves known in Caldwell's one-street commerce. But Alice had grown up in a city where different dangers moved in different ways, and she had long since decided that fear was a tool to be used wisely rather than a companion to be accommodated. The following morning, which was Sunday, she was surprised to find Albert Underwood waiting outside the mercantile when she came out from her rooms above the hardware store. He was holding 2 cups of coffee from the diner across the street, and he had a somewhat uncertain look about him, as if he had arrived at the decision to be there, and then immediately begun questioning it. "I thought you might want company for a ride out to the property," he said. "I've done some construction work, among other things. I thought I might take a look at the rafter system you mentioned." Alice considered him. "Do you always bring coffee to women you've met once?" "No," he said honestly. "I bring coffee to people I want to have a useful conversation with. You seemed like you'd have a useful conversation." She took the coffee. "I ride out this morning. You're welcome to come if you want." He came. He spent the first hour examining the house structure with a methodical attention that Alice found herself respecting almost against her will. He had clearly been telling the truth about his construction experience. He ran his hands along the wall joists, checked the foundation stones, tested the floor planks with his weight in several places, and finally stood in the middle of the caved-in section of the roof looking up at the sky through the hole with an expression of professional assessment. "You're right about the rafter design," he said. "The original builder used a single-ridge system without proper purlins. In a heavy snow year, the center ridge bears too much load. It'll take new timber and about a week of work to do it properly, but the walls are solid. The house is worth fixing." "I know," said Alice. He looked at her. "Yes, you clearly do." There was no condescension in it. He said it like a man acknowledging a fact. They walked the creek together, and Alice showed him the spring she had found in the limestone formation, and Albert crouched over it and tested the water and agreed that it was a reliable source, and that digging a new well 50 yards east of the existing one would put them directly in the path of the underground flow. "You'll want a professional well digger," he said. "It's not the kind of work you can do on your own, and there's risk in it if it's done wrong." "I know a man in Caldwell," Alice said. "Elias Croft. He's reasonable and he does good work." "Do you know everyone in Caldwell?" "I keep the accounts for the mercantile," she said. "I know everyone who buys things and what they buy, which is most of what there is to know about a person." Albert laughed at that, and it was a good laugh, not too loud and not too restrained, and it made Commissioner look up from the grass where he had been investigating something with his nose. They ate the lunch Alice had packed sitting on the bank of Widow's Run with their boots off and their feet in the water, because the day had grown hot in the way that early September in Kansas could still manage, and the creek was cold and clear over smooth stones. Alice told him about Cincinnati and her mother and the train journey west, and the 3 years working for Virgil Prout, and the tin box under the floorboard. Albert told her about Missouri, which was where he had grown up, and about going to Colorado at 22 with a group of other young men who had all been certain there was gold to be found, and about finding instead that he had a genuine talent for working with horses and a reasonable one for construction, and a complete absence of the reckless luck that gold mining seemed to require. "How did you come to be in Caldwell?" Alice asked. "A man named Cole Harding runs the Meridian Ranch. He was passing through Colorado on his way back from Denver, and he needed an experienced hand who could also help rebuild some of his outbuildings. Someone recommended me. It seemed as good a direction as any." "Do you like it? The Meridian?" Albert was quiet for a moment, turning a smooth stone over in his fingers. "I like the work," he said carefully. "I like Harding well enough. I've been comfortable there. But comfortable isn't the same as right, and I've been thinking for some time that I'd like to find something that was actually right." Alice looked at the water moving over the stones. She understood that feeling exactly. It was precisely the feeling that had put her in front of Gerald Fitch's auction with $400 in an envelope. "What would right look like?" she asked. He looked at her sideways for a moment and then back at the water. "I'm not entirely sure yet," he said. "I'm working on that." She put her boots back on and said they'd better look at the drainage berm before the light changed, and he put his boots back on and followed her without making anything of the moment, which she appreciated. She had met men who would have pressed the conversation somewhere it wasn't ready to go, and the fact that Albert Underwood let it rest where it was told her something about his character that a much longer acquaintance might not have. The berm was where she had calculated it, a low ridge of compacted sediment and clay running across the south quarter about 100 yards from the creek. Albert walked its length with her, digging at it periodically with the heel of his boot, and agreed that 2 cuts at the right angles would redirect the seasonal overflow into the natural draw that ran along the west fence line. "That's perhaps 3 days' work with the right tools," he said. "A spade and a mattock and someone who doesn't mind getting muddy." "I don't mind getting muddy," Alice said. "I didn't imagine you did." On the ride back to Caldwell in the long amber light of early evening, they rode side by side without talking much, and the silence was comfortable in the way that silences between people who are paying attention to the same things tend to be. Alice was thinking about roof timber and well-digging costs, and the price of seed for the winter wheat she hoped to get into the ground by October. She thought, once, about what it had been like to sit with bare feet in the cold creek, beside a man who asked what she saw in things rather than telling her what was wrong with them, and she put the thought away carefully to look at later. In the weeks that followed, Albert Underwood appeared at the Holt place. Alice had already begun to call it the Slater place in her mind, though she hadn't said so yet out loud, with a regularity that moved from occasional to expected without either of them quite announcing the transition. He came on his days off from the meridian, which were Sundays and sometimes Thursdays, and he brought tools and his labor and occasionally food, and he worked alongside Alice with a steady, uncomplaining competence that she found deeply attractive without yet being willing to describe it that way. They hired Elias Croft to dig the well in the second week of September, and Elias, who was a quiet man in his 50s who had dug more wells in South Kansas than he could count, found water at 32 feet exactly where Alice had predicted it would be, and said with some surprise that the young woman seemed to have a feel for the land that he hadn't seen in someone who hadn't grown up farming. Alice thanked him and paid him from the envelope in her reticule, and the well was finished and cased by the end of the week. The roof was harder. They spent 2 Sundays hauling timber from the mill in Caldwell in the wagon Alice borrowed from a neighbor named Hetty Crane, who was a widow of 63 with a sharp tongue and a generous nature who had taken an approving interest in Alice's enterprise. Hetty Crane also had opinions about Albert Underwood that she shared with Alice in detail while they were shelling beans on Hetty's porch one evening in mid-September. "He comes out there every Sunday," Hetty said. "He's been helpful," Alice said. "He watches you when you're not looking at him." "Hetty, he does. I've seen it. I drove out with the timber Tuesday and I watched the man for a solid hour. He watches you the way a person watches something they're trying to understand." "He's just being helpful," Alice said, and the certainty in her voice was perhaps 10% less firm than she would have liked. "Alice, I have been married and widowed, and I have watched more men watch more women than you have had years in this world. And that man is not just being helpful. He is being helpful because being helpful gives him a reason to be there, which is where he wants to be." Alice shelled several more beans without responding, and Hetty left the subject alone with the wisdom of someone who knew when a point had been made and needed no elaboration. The roof was finished by the 1st of October, and it was a good roof, properly made with ridge boards and purlins, and the kind of careful joinery that would stand up to whatever Kansas winters chose to throw at it. Alice stood in the main room of the house on the last day of the work, and looked up at the new timber overhead, and felt something she could only describe as the sensation of a place becoming real. She had been coming out here for a month, and sleeping in the repaired back bedroom, and cooking on the old iron stove, and living among the tools and sawdust and work in progress of it all. But the completed roof somehow made the whole thing true in a way that the deed had not quite managed. Albert was on the porch outside nailing the last of the new fascia boards into place, and she could hear the rhythm of his hammer and Commissioner barking at a ground squirrel somewhere in the distance. And the late afternoon sun was coming in through the windows at an angle that lit up all the dust motes in the air, and Alice stood in the middle of her own house and felt her eyes fill up unexpectedly. She didn't make any sound, and she blinked it away before she went back outside, because she was not a woman who showed that kind of feeling without being ready to, but it was there, and it was real, and it was about more than a roof. Albert climbed down from the ladder and looked at the completed work with quiet satisfaction. He ran his hand along the eave board the way a person touches something they are proud of without wanting to make a show of it. "That'll hold," he said. "It will," Alice agreed. "Albert." She paused. "Thank you for all of this. I want you to know I understand what you've given up on your days off to be here, and it has made a real difference." He looked at her with an expression she had been noticing more and more in recent weeks, the one that was very still and very direct, and that seemed to be organizing itself around something it hadn't yet found the right words for. "I haven't given up anything," he said. "I've been exactly where I wanted to be." She remembered Hetty Crane's words, and she looked at him for a moment longer than she might have before she looked away at the plains going orange in the sunset, and she said, "Well, you'd better stay for supper then." He stayed for supper. He had stayed for supper 4 times before, but this time felt different in a way that both of them noticed and neither of them directly addressed, which was perhaps the most honest way to acknowledge that something had shifted. They ate Alice's biscuits, and the rabbit stew she had made from a rabbit commissioner had flushed out of the creek brush that afternoon. And they talked about the winter wheat planting, and the drainage work that still needed finishing, and about a man in town named Dawson who had offered to sell Alice 3 young heifers at a reasonable price, and about everything practical and immediate. And underneath all of it was something warm and unspoken that sat between them at the table like a third presence. After they had cleaned the plates and Albert had fed the scraps to Commissioner and the 2 elderly goats, who were named magistrate and counselor in keeping with the legal theme Alice had established, they sat on the repaired porch steps in the dark with the first cool touch of October in the air and the stars overhead in their millions, the way stars only appeared over flat land where nothing interrupted them. Albert said, "Can I ask you something?" "You've been asking me things since the day we met," Alice said. "I don't see why you'd stop now. Do you ever think about what this place will be, not what it needs fixing, but what it'll be when it's finished?" Alice looked up at the stars. "I think about it all the time. I want winter wheat in the north and south fields, and a kitchen garden on the east side of the house where the soil is richest, and I want to raise a small herd of cattle, nothing like the big ranches, but enough to sell some in the fall. I want the barn properly rebuilt so I can keep horses. I want the porch fixed all the way around, and I want to plant cottonwoods along the creek bank so there's shade in the summers, and I want—" She stopped. "What?" Albert asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I want it to be a home," she said, "not just a working property. I want it to be a place where things happen, good things, things that build up over time. I want it to be the kind of place that looks different in 20 years because of all the life that's been lived in it." Albert was quiet for a long time after that. The darkness around them was full of cricket sound and the distant coyote conversation and the soft sound of the creek. "That's a beautiful thing to want," he said at last, and there was something in his voice that made it more than an observation. The following Thursday, which was not his usual day but which he appeared on anyway, Albert Underwood arrived at the Slater place at mid-morning and said that he had come to help with the drainage berm cutting, and that he had brought a mattock and a proper surveying stake from town. They worked on the berm all day, cutting the 2 channels Alice had mapped, and by late afternoon the water that had been collecting in the south quarter was following the draw along the west fence line exactly as she had calculated it would. Albert was standing knee-deep in the drainage cut watching the water move, and he had mud to his elbows, and his hat had fallen off somewhere in the creek brush an hour ago, and he was laughing at something Commissioner was doing with the displaced frogs. And Alice, who was standing on the bank watching him, felt the thing that had been building for 6 weeks arrive completely, and without any further possibility of being set aside. She was in love with him. It was not a gradual realization, but rather the sudden recognition of something that had been true for some time, and that she had simply been declining to look at directly. She loved the way he asked questions. She loved the steadiness of him, the way he worked without complaining and thought before he spoke, and never once in all these weeks had made her feel that her ambitions were anything other than entirely reasonable. She loved that he had been the only one to ask what she saw in the ruined place, when everyone else had only told her what was wrong with it. She stood on the bank of the drainage cut with mud on her boots and her hair coming down from its pins in the wind, and she thought, with complete clarity, "This is a problem." It was a problem because Albert Underwood was a ranch hand at the Meridian with no land and uncertain plans, and Alice Slater had just bought 80 acres, and she had not bought them to hand over her decision-making to anyone. It was a problem because the feelings were large, and she had no way of knowing if they were returned. It was a problem because she had built her life around self-sufficiency, and she was not entirely sure how love fit into a plan she had already committed to. She stepped back from the bank and walked to the house to put on the kettle, and none of these problems made any impression whatsoever on the feeling itself, which continued to exist with complete indifference to her objections. October moved through Caldwell like a slow procession, all golden light and cold mornings, and the sound of the cattle drives thinning out as the season ended, and the drovers began their southward returns. Alice planted her winter wheat in the north field over the course of a week, working the rows herself with the rented plow equipment and the draft horse she had borrowed from Elias Croft, who had taken a neighborly interest in her progress. Albert helped her on the Sunday in the middle of the planting, walking the rows beside her and operating the seed drill with the easy rhythm of a man who had done farm work before, though he had never specifically claimed it. In the evenings of that week, when Alice came in from the fields tired and honest in the way that physical labor makes a person honest, she wrote letters to the Agricultural Extension Office in Topeka, asking about soil amendment techniques and variety recommendations for the particular soil composition of her property. She had a running correspondence with a woman there named Martha Higgins, who seemed delighted to be writing to a female farmer, and who sent back long, detailed letters that Alice read at the kitchen table by lamplight. It was on a Tuesday in late October, on one of those lamplit evenings with the wind coming up outside and Commissioner at her feet, that there was a knock at her door. She found Albert on the porch with his hat in his hands and an expression she had not seen on him before. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made a decision and was now standing on the far side of it wondering if the ground would hold. "I have something I want to say," he said. "And I'd rather say it straight than find a comfortable way around it." Alice stepped back from the door. "Come in, then." He came in and stood by the kitchen table, and she sat down across from it and waited with her hands folded, the way she waited when someone was about to tell her something important. Albert looked at his hat for a moment, then looked at her. "I've been thinking about what you said on the porch 3 weeks ago," he said, "about wanting the place to be a home. About wanting things to build up over time. I've been thinking about it more than I should probably admit." Alice said nothing. "I've been in a lot of places," he said, "and I've been useful in a lot of places, and I've moved on from every one of them without feeling like I was leaving something essential behind. I came out here to help with the work, and I told myself that was all I was doing. But I think you deserve a person who's honest with you, and so I'm going to be honest, which is that I haven't been just helping with the work. I've been trying to be near you because I find that being near you is the only thing that feels like what you described, like something right rather than just comfortable." The kitchen was very quiet. The wind moved past the windows. "I'm not asking anything of you," Albert continued. "I'm not asking to be part of your plans or to have any claim on what you're building here. I only wanted to say it because I thought you should know, and because I didn't want to be the kind of man who pretends he's just being a neighbor when he's not." Alice looked at him for a long moment, this lean and steady man with his hat in his hands and his creekwater eyes and his 6 weeks of honest labor beside her, and she said, "Albert, do you remember the morning after the auction when you told me you were looking for something that was actually right rather than just comfortable?" "Yes," he said. "I've been thinking about that too," she said, "more than I should probably admit." He was very still. "I have 100 concerns," she said, "about what it means for this place and what I'm building here, and about whether a man and a woman can work together on land without one of them diminishing the other. I have concerns about being sensible, and I have concerns about being foolish in different directions, but I don't have any concerns about you specifically. I find that I trust you, which is not a thing I give easily, and I find that—" She stopped, and then said carefully, "I find that you are the person I want to be sitting on that porch with." Albert put his hat down on the table very gently, and then he moved around the corner of the table and he took both her hands in his, and they were warm and calloused from all those weeks of shared labor, and he said quietly, "Then that's where I'll be." He stayed for supper, and then he stayed sitting on the porch in the cold October dark until they had talked themselves somewhere past midnight, and when he finally rode back toward the meridian, Alice stood in the doorway watching the lantern of his horse disappear into the darkness, and Commissioner sat beside her, and she thought that this was what it felt like when a plan became something larger than a plan. November came in cold and direct, and with it the business of winter preparation that had no patience for distraction. Alice spent the first week cutting and splitting firewood from the dead cottonwood along the East Creek bank with a determination that left her pleasantly exhausted and earned her a look from Albert when he arrived on Sunday and found 3 cords neatly stacked under the new eave. "You did all of this yourself," he said. "I did," she said. "I found it highly satisfying." He laughed and picked up the maul and split another dozen logs without being asked, and she appreciated that he had not offered to do it for her but only done it alongside her, which was, she was coming to understand, exactly the way Albert Underwood worked. He did not take over. He added himself. They had a conversation that November Sunday that she returned to many times afterward. They were sitting inside by the stove with coffee, the cold pressing against the windows, and Albert said he had been talking with Cole Harding at the Meridian. "About what?" Alice asked. "About my situation," he said. "I told him I intended to leave the ranch come spring, that I had other plans." Alice looked up from her coffee. "What other plans?" Albert looked at her directly, the way he always did. "I'd like to buy into this property," he said. "Not as a takeover of anything, I want to be clear about that. As a partner. I have money saved, not much, about $350, but I could put it toward rebuilding the barn properly and buying the heifers from Dawson and getting seed for the spring planting. We could do more together than either of us could do separately, and I think you know that." Alice was quiet. "I'm not asking to be in charge of anything," he said. "This is your land, your deed, your vision. I know you well enough to know you'd walk away from a partnership that tried to put you in second place, and I want to be clear that that's not what I'm proposing." "What are you proposing?" Alice asked. Albert set his coffee down and said, with the directness she had come to love, "I'm proposing that I'd like to build a life here with you, if you'll have me. I'm proposing that I'd like to be the person you sit on the porch with, not just on occasional evenings but permanently. I'm proposing that I love you, Alice, and that I think you know that already, and I'd like to know if you'll marry me." The fire popped in the stove. Commissioner shifted on the floor. Alice looked at Albert Underwood, who was watching her with that steady, direct gaze and not a trace of the entitled presumption she had spent years defending herself against. He had asked. He had been clear about the terms. He had said the word love in a plain sentence without dressing it up into something manipulative. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you, on the condition that the deed stays in my name and that we make our decisions together." "Those were already my conditions," he said and smiled. It was the best smile she had ever seen. They were married on the 14th of December, 1878, in the Caldwell Methodist Church with Hetty Crane and Elias Croft as witnesses and Gerald Fitch in the front pew, looking like a man who was revising some assumptions he had made in September. The preacher was a young man named Reverend Davies who had arrived in Caldwell that fall, and who conducted the ceremony with a genuine warmth that surprised both of them. Alice wore her blue dress with her mother's cameo brooch, and Albert wore the good coat he had bought in Caldwell on a cold November Tuesday, and they stood together in front of the small congregation and said the words to each other with the particular attentiveness of people who mean every syllable. Hetty Crane cried, which she would have denied strenuously if asked. They spent their first winter in the Slater place, which was also now, in all the ways that mattered, the Underwood place, making it livable in the fullest sense of the word. Albert moved out of the Meridian bunkhouse and into the homestead, and the intimacy of the small house in winter, the sharing of mornings and evenings, and the private vocabulary that develops between two people who are paying close attention to each other, was something neither of them had anticipated fully, even though they had been friends and then lovers of the careful sort before the wedding, and it was better than they had anticipated. Albert's money went toward the barn. He hired a carpenter from Caldwell named Thomas Hale, and worked alongside him through December and January in the freezing cold, the two of them in heavy coats and breath fogging in the air. And the barn that rose from the old footprint was straight and solid and large enough for 4 horses and a winter hay store. The day the last board went up, Alice came out from the house with coffee for both men and stood looking at the structure in the thin December sunlight. And she looked at Albert over the rim of her cup, with an expression that said more than the practical situation required. They bought Dawson's 3 heifers in January, young Hereford crosses with the round-eyed docility that made them good starter cattle. And they spent a mildly absurd February afternoon trying to convince the heifers to enter the new barn, which the heifers regarded with the deep suspicion that cattle reserve for any enclosed space they have not personally approved. Albert and Alice stood on opposite sides of the yard directing the operation, and at one point all 3 heifers were running in a loose circle around the yard, while Commissioner ran after them barking with misplaced enthusiasm. And Albert was laughing so hard he had to put his hands on his knees. And Alice was laughing too, and it was, she thought, one of the best afternoons of her life. Spring came to Caldwell in 1879, with the particular generosity it sometimes produced after a hard winter, warm and gradual and green, in a way that made the plains look like they had been waiting all winter to show what they could do. Alice's winter wheat came up in strong rows across the north and south fields, the alkaline shock of the previous years broken by the amendments she had worked in the previous fall. The kitchen garden on the east side of the house erupted with the unseemly enthusiasm of very good soil that had been resting too long, and she had to expand it twice by April to accommodate what was growing. They hired a young man named Jesse Birch that spring, 19 years old, the son of a failed homesteader from the next county over who had left his family in poor circumstances and come to Caldwell looking for work. Jesse was thin and eager and not very skilled at most things but entirely willing to learn, and Albert took him on as a project with a patience that Alice watched with a quiet warmth. Jesse adored Alice with the uncomplicated hero worship of a young man who had not seen many women take charge of their own land, and he treated the Slater place with the proprietary loyalty of someone who had been given a real place to belong. One morning in April, Jesse was in the barn grooming Alice's roan mare. She had bought the mare, whose name was Temperance, from Cole Harding in March, when he came running to the house to say there were 2 men on the property, coming up the south road, and that he didn't know them. Albert came out of the house before Alice did, with the unhurried alertness of a man who had encountered unexpected arrivals before and knew how to calibrate his response. The 2 men who rode up were rough-looking in the particular way that distinguished men who lived hard from men who simply worked hard, and Alice, who came out onto the porch a moment later with her hand resting on the door frame, watched them with the assessor's attention she gave to most things. The larger of the 2 men said they were looking for work and had heard the Slater place was hiring. Albert told them they had hired for the season and were set, and the man's eyes went past Albert to Alice on the porch, and he said something about the woman of the house, and the particular flavor of what he said made the air sharpen. Albert said, quietly and without moving particularly, that the woman of the house was the owner of the property and the person to whom he himself reported, and that they would be moving on now. There was a moment of the kind of tension that had a shape to it, the shape of 2 men calculating whether the situation was worth pressing, and a third man who was giving them very calm information about how that calculation would go. The 2 riders exchanged a look, and then they turned their horses and rode back out the south road without saying anything further. Jesse let out a breath that had been held for some time. Alice came down from the porch and stood beside Albert and watched the riders diminish down the road, and she said, "Thank you. You didn't need me to do that," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I didn't mind you doing it." He looked at her sideways with the small smile she had catalogued as belonging specifically to moments when he was pleased about something he wasn't going to make a fuss about. They went back inside and had breakfast. Summer of 1879 was the summer the Slater place became a real farm. The wheat came in well, not a spectacular yield but a sound one, enough to sell a portion at the Caldwell grain market and put the rest into the storage they had built at the back of the barn. The kitchen garden produced enough that Alice was selling vegetables to the Caldwell mercantile, not to Virgil Prout, who had retired in the spring and been replaced by a man named Abner Cross, who was considerably less interested in reminding Alice of her debt of gratitude and drying and canning the surplus for winter. They had 4 horses in the barn now. Temperance, Albert's gray gelding named Porter, a young working horse named Ben that Albert had found underpriced at a stock sale in Wichita, and an older quarter horse of Jesse's that the boy had managed to acquire through a series of trades that he explained with the pleased evasiveness of someone who knew a good deal when he saw one. In June, the 3 Hereford heifers produced the first of what would become a small but steady herd. 2 calves from the first heifer, 1 from the second, and a delayed arrival from the third that came on a warm July midnight with Alice and Albert and Jesse all in the barn by lamplight. The whole enterprise conducted with the particular mix of urgency and ordinariness that agricultural life in 1878 Kansas required of its practitioners. Albert, who was holding the lantern and had been doing so for 2 hours, looked at Alice as she helped guide the third calf into the world with the competent assurance of a woman who had read every piece of available literature on the subject, and then applied it practically. And he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that there was no other person in the world he would rather be standing in a barn with at midnight. Alice cleaned up and they walked back to the house together in the warm summer dark while Jessie stayed in the barn with the new family, and Albert took her hand, which was the kind of gesture that 2 people who have been quietly in love for months in circumstances that don't allow much for gesture tend to make count. "I want to tell you something," he said as they walked. "Tell me." "I've never been as happy as I am here," he said. "I want you to know that. In case there are days when it's not obvious or I'm not saying it properly." Alice tightened her hand around his. "I know," she said. "I feel the same." They walked to the house in the summer dark, and the stars were enormous overhead, and Commissioner met them at the porch steps with his tail going. That autumn, they had a conversation that Alice had been building toward for some months without quite finding the right moment to begin it. They were sitting at the kitchen table after supper on an evening in late August, with the windows open to the last warmth and the lamp burning low between them, and Alice had been looking at her notebook with its columns of figures, and she put it down and said, "I want to tell you what I've been thinking." Albert put down the harness strap he had been mending and looked at her. "This place is working," she said. "It's more than working. We have income from the wheat and the vegetables, and we'll have income from the cattle in the fall. We have the barn and the well and the drainage all functioning. Jessie is becoming genuinely skilled. We are in better shape at the end of year 1 than I projected we would be." "That's true," Albert said. "I want to think about expanding," she said. "There are 40 acres adjacent to our north field that have been unoccupied since the family that homesteaded them left in '76. I've been talking to the county land office, and they believe the land could be made available for homestead claim. 40 more acres of that quality would nearly double our wheat capacity." Albert leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the expression she recognized as his serious thinking face, which was not a grim expression but a concentrated one. "The Homestead Act would require residence on the new claim," he said. "We'd have to demonstrate improvement. Jesse could establish residence on the new parcel if we build a small structure for him," Alice said. "He's of legal age and he's been talking about wanting something of his own. We could offer him a stake in the expanded acreage in exchange for working it." Albert thought about this. "That's good," he said. "That's really good, Alice." "I know," she said, and allowed herself a small smile. "You've already drafted the proposal, haven't you?" he said. "There's a version of it in the second notebook," she admitted. He reached across the table and took her hand and said, "What would I do without you organizing my world?" "You'd manage," she said, "but the records would be in disorder." In September of 1879, Exactly 1 year after Alice had stood in front of Gerald Fitch with her $400, Jesse Birch filed a homestead claim on the 40 adjacent acres with Alice and Albert acting as witnesses and guarantors. They broke ground on a small but sound one-room cabin at the north edge of the new parcel and spent 2 weekends building it together. The four of them, Alice, Albert, Jesse, and Hetty Crane, who showed up uninvited with a pot of stew and opinions about the door placement, making quick work of it in the warm fall days. Jesse stood in front of his finished cabin on a Sunday afternoon with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that Albert recognized, because it was the same look he had first seen on Alice's face the afternoon she'd walked the ruined Holt place in the August heat of 1878, the look of a person standing in the right place. "It's yours," Alice told him. "Work it honestly and in 5 years you'll have a deed." Jesse looked at her and then at Albert and said, somewhat inadequately, "I won't let you down." "I know," said Alice. "Now come have supper." In the late October of 1879, Alice told Albert she was expecting a baby. She told him in the kitchen on a weekday morning, because there was no particular ceremony required for news that she had been thinking about for 3 weeks, and that Albert had perhaps been too occupied with the fall harvest to notice the signs of, though she suspected he had noticed more than he let on. Albert went very still for a moment in the way he did when something arrived that was larger than an ordinary feeling, and then he said, "Alice," and then he didn't say anything else for a moment, and she watched his face go through several things without settling, and then arrive at something simple and enormous. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and held her carefully, the way people hold things that matter too much for the usual grip. "Are you well?" he asked into her hair. "I'm very well," she said, "a little tired and a great deal pleased." "You're certain?" "I've been certain for 3 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I said it." 3 weeks, he said. She could feel him smiling. "I process things at my own pace," she said, which made him laugh, and the laugh against the top of her head was warm and genuine, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held entirely. Hetty Crane took the news with a satisfaction that bordered on the cosmic, as if she had personally arranged it. Elias Croft shook Albert's hand and said he was pleased. Jesse Birch went quite red and said that was wonderful news, ma'am, and then went and did something productive in the barn for about 40 minutes before coming back to his regular demeanor. Alice worked through the autumn with her characteristic pragmatism, modified by the occasional acknowledgement that carrying a child while running a farm in Kansas in 1879 required some adjustments to her usual approach. She delegated more to Albert and Jesse, which she did without resentment because she had built the delegation systems thoughtfully, and because the people she was delegating to were competent. She continued her correspondence with Martha Higgins in Topeka, who had strong opinions about the proper management of a farm during a first pregnancy, and expressed them with a warmth that Alice found unexpectedly comforting. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was milder than the previous year, and the Slater place went through it with the settled competence of a working farm in its second year, which is a different creature from a working farm in its first. The animals were healthy, the stores were adequate, the roof held magnificently, and the well ran cold and clear. Albert, as Alice's confinement drew closer in the spring, became solicitous in ways that she received with a mixture of genuine appreciation and occasional exasperation, because she was Alice, and she did not stop having opinions about her own capacity simply because she was 7 months pregnant. "I can carry the water bucket," she told him one morning in February. "I know you can," he said, taking it from her. "I'm carrying it because I want to." "That is not a reasonable answer." "No," he agreed pleasantly, "but it's true." She let him carry the water bucket because she loved him, and because she was 7 months pregnant and the bucket was heavy, and because there was a kind of grace in allowing people who loved you to do things for you without it diminishing anyone's dignity. Their son was born in April of 1880, on a clear morning with the windows open to the sound of the spring birds and Hetty Crane in attendance. She had delivered babies before, and she did not trust the Caldwell doctor, whose hands were frequently cold, and Alice came through it with the determination and vocal directness that characterized everything she did, and the baby arrived in the world apparently ready for it, which did not surprise anyone who knew his mother. They named him William Thomas Underwood, the Thomas for Alice's grandfather in Cincinnati, who had been a practical and decent man she had loved, and the William for no reason in particular, except that it sounded like the name of a person who would be useful and good, which was their principal ambition for him. Albert held his son for the first time sitting in the kitchen chair while Alice rested in the bedroom, and the look on his face was the one she could see from the doorway, the look she would remember her whole life. A man who had traveled through Colorado and Missouri and half a dozen other places looking for the thing that was right rather than comfortable, holding it in his arms. She went back to bed and slept deeply and well. William was a good baby by the measure of babies in general, which is to say he was demanding and loud, and in need of constant attention, and also absolutely the center of the universe. Jessie Birch visited on Sunday afternoons and held the baby with the terrified reverence of a young man encountering an infant for the first time, and Commissioner stationed himself permanently under the cradle with an air of grave personal responsibility. The farm in the summer of 1880 operated on the modified schedule of a household with a new baby, which Albert and Alice negotiated between them with the practical good humor that had always characterized their management of difficulty. She was nursing and could not be away from the house for the lengths of time that some of the field work required, so Albert and Jessie took the heavier outdoor work while Alice ran the household accounts and the correspondence and the garden from a closer radius. It was not a perfect arrangement, and they both knew it, and they adjusted it as the months went on, and William became more portable, and Alice became more willing to be out of sight of his cradle for more than 20 minutes. There was one afternoon in August when they had a genuine argument, the first real argument of their marriage, about whether Alice should ride out to the north field to assess a problem with the wheat drainage that Jessie had reported. Albert's position was that she should let him handle it. Alice's position was that she understood the drainage system better than anyone, and that riding to the north field was not a medical risk. The argument had an edge to it, the kind that comes when people who both have strong convictions apply them to the same situation simultaneously, and they said some things that were not wrong exactly but were not as careful as they could have been, and there was a half hour in the late afternoon during which they were both very busy doing separate things. And then Albert came and found her in the kitchen and said, "You're right that you know the drainage better. I was worried, and I expressed it badly." And Alice said, "I understand you were worried. I should have acknowledged that instead of only defending my position." And then they rode to the north field together, with William in the carrier Hetty Crane had made, and Alice identified the drainage problem in about 15 minutes and told Jessie what to do about it. And they rode home in the early evening with the baby asleep against Alice's chest, and the argument settled not by one of them winning, but by both of them being honest about what it had actually been about, which was love expressed as fear, which was a thing that would require management for as long as they were together. Autumn of 1880 brought the wheat harvest on both the original 80 acres and the first productive season on Jessie's adjacent claim, and the combined yield was enough to make a real difference in their financial position. Alice spent a November week in concentrated accounting and arrived at a set of figures that she showed Albert at the kitchen table. "We can retire the remaining debt on the barn equipment," she said, "and put enough aside to buy a proper breeding bull in the spring. And there's enough left to begin proper fencing on the east boundary, which we've needed since we bought the place." Albert studied the figures. "You've left a contingency for a bad year." "Always," she said. "And this?" He pointed to a line in the ledger. "What's this category?" Alice looked at it. "Expansion fund," she said. In 3 years, if the numbers continue as projected, we could afford to buy Harding's parcel when he retires, which I have on good authority from Hetty that he intends to do within the decade. That would give us another 200 acres. Albert looked at her. You have a 10-year plan. I have a 15-year plan, she said. The 10-year plan is the conservative projection. He looked at her with the full warmth of the feeling that had not diminished by a single degree since the October Tuesday he had arrived at her kitchen table, and said he loved her. Alice Underwood, he said, you are the most remarkable person I have ever known. She looked pleased in the direct, unsentimental way she accepted genuine compliments, which was without deflection but without excessive production. I know, she said. Now look at these fencing estimates. The years move the way good years do, which is with a fullness that makes them feel both slow in the living and swift in the looking back. William grew from a baby into a walking, talking person with his mother's observational intensity and his father's steadiness, and an additional quality all his own, which was an almost alarming cheerfulness in the face of all information. He followed Albert through the fields and Jessie through the adjacent claim with the proprietary tour guide energy of a small person who considered both parcels his personal domain, which he did, with the confidence of a child who has grown up in a place where everything is solid. In the spring of 1882, Alice was expecting their second child, and she told Albert this with the same directness she had employed the first time, and he held her the same way and said, "Are you well?" The same way, and she said she was very well, the same way, and then added that she intended to continue riding until she couldn't, which made him smile. Their second child was a boy again, which caused Hetty Crane to say cheerfully that they were consistent, at any rate. They named him Robert, after a friend of Albert's from Missouri who had been kind when Albert was young and starting out, and had not had much, and Robert arrived in November of 1882, with William standing outside the bedroom door with Commissioner, both of them listening with the shared attention of creatures who understood something significant was occurring. Robert was louder than William and less serene about his opinions, which were many and strongly held from approximately his first week of life, and Alice loved him with a fierceness that surprised her even in its familiarity. The way each child surprises you into loving them in new-shaped ways even when you already knew you would. Jesse Birch proved up on his Homestead claim in 1883, receiving his deed from the county land office on a February morning with Alice and Albert standing beside him, and he held the paper the same way Alice had held hers 5 years before, and she recognized the look and put her hand on his shoulder and said, "There it is." "There it is," Jesse agreed, and his voice was not entirely steady. Cole Harding announced his intention to retire in the spring of 1884 and put the Meridian Ranch up for sale, which was not quite the sequence Alice's 15-year plan had projected, but was close enough. Albert negotiated with Harding directly over the course of 3 months, and the resulting arrangement, a purchase of the Meridian's southern 212 acres, which abutted their own property, was completed in July of 1884 with a combination of their accumulated savings, a bank loan that Alice had negotiated in Wichita with the sharp-eyed clarity of a woman who knew her own numbers better than the banker across the desk, and a deferred payment arrangement that Harding accepted because Albert had worked for him honestly, and he trusted the Underwood couple's ability to make good on it. On the day they completed the purchase, Alice and Albert rode the new boundary on horseback together, just the two of them, in the long summer evening, and the land ran around them in all directions. And it was, when you looked at the full picture, 332 acres of operational farm and ranch land in South Kansas, all of it feeding back into itself in the interlocking way of a place that has been thought about carefully for 6 years. Alice rode beside her husband in the low gold light, and she thought about the morning in September of 1878 when she had stood in the ruin of the old Holt homestead, with the switchgrass moving around her and Commissioner investigating the barn, and no one in the world who thought she could see anything in the place except her. And then a man with creekwater eyes had asked what she saw in it. She looked at Albert riding beside her, his dark hair threaded with silver now at the temples from the outdoor work and the years, the same steady profile, and the same way of looking at the land that she had been looking at the land, which was to say as if it were a living thing deserving of attention. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about what I saw in the ruined place," she said. He looked at her. "I saw 80 acres that people gave up on," she said, "and now I'm seeing 332. Not a bad return on $250, he said. "Not bad at all." They rode back in the growing dark toward the lights of the house, which showed warm against the plains, the kitchen lamp in the window, and the new lantern on the repaired porch, and somewhere inside the sound of William and Robert in their particular evening chaos. In 1885, they had a daughter, who they named Clara Marie Underwood, the Marie for Alice's mother. Clara arrived on a spring morning when the cottonwoods Alice had planted along the creek bank in the first year were 15 feet tall and in full leaf, and the house was full of the good noise of children and work, and the complicated beautiful life that had grown from one woman's clear vision of what an 80-acre ruin could become. William, who was 5 by then, received the news of a sister with thoughtful consideration, and then announced that he intended to teach her to ride, which was, given that she was 12 hours old, ambitious even by his standards. Robert, who was 3 and less philosophical, sat next to the cradle and patted Clara's hand with the tender clumsiness of a small child encountering something fragile, and Alice watched them from her bed and felt the absolute completeness of the moment. Albert sat beside her that evening and held her hand and looked at the sleeping baby in the cradle and said nothing for a long time, and then said, very quietly, "Thank you." She knew he didn't mean only the baby, and she squeezed his hand and said, "Thank you for asking." "Asking what?" "What I saw in it," she said. "The ruined place. Everyone else told me what was wrong with it. You asked what I saw. That was everything, Albert." He turned to look at her, and his expression was the one she had catalogued over 7 years as belonging to the moments when he felt too much to say it all. "I didn't do anything," he said. "You saw it. You always saw it. I just wanted to know what you were looking at." "That was enough," she said. "That was more than enough." Commissioner was 11 years old by 1885, which was a good age for a dog who had appointed himself the official supervisor of an 80-acre ruin and watched it become something else entirely. He moved more slowly now, and he had taken to spending his afternoons on the repaired porch with the dignified repose of an elder statesman reviewing a successful administration. He still met Alice at the door every morning, still positioned himself under the kitchen table during meals, still regarded the goats. Magistrate had died in 1881 and councillor in 1882, but there were new goats now, 2 of them, named legislature and jurisdiction, because Alice maintained the legal theme with the patient condescension that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Jessie Birch married in the summer of 1885, a woman named Ada Hooper from Wichita who had come to Caldwell to work at the new hotel, and who had strong opinions about many things, and an immediate and mutual respect for Alice that manifested as a warm and practical friendship. Ada arrived in Caldwell, met Alice, looked at the expanded Slater farm operation, and decided that whatever Jessie had been telling her in his letters about the Underwoods had been, if anything, an understatement. Ada was exactly what Jessie needed, which was someone whose energy matched his own and whose organizational capacity was greater than his. And Alice watched the 2 of them set up their life on the adjacent claim, with the particular pleasure of watching competent people make good decisions. The Caldwell that Alice had arrived in as a 23-year-old widow's daughter in 1875 was not the Caldwell of 1885. The cattle trail drives that had defined the town's rough edge in those early years were declining, as the railroad pushed further into the territory and the Kansas farming communities expanded. The lawlessness that had made the border country uncertain in the 1870s had given way to the slower and less dramatic process of settlement taking hold in a genuine way. Caldwell had a proper schoolhouse now, and a second church, and a doctor who had been there long enough to have earned the trust of most of his patients, and a newspaper that covered events beyond the purely immediate. Alice's children went to the schoolhouse from the fall of 1887, when William was 7, and she went to the school board meeting that October and made several observations about the curriculum that were received with the mixed response she had come to expect and had entirely stopped being bothered by. The school's reading materials were improved the following spring, partly as a result of her correspondence with the Topeka Education Office, and partly because she donated 36 books from her own collection, which was considerable by the standards of any household in South Kansas in 1887. Albert continued to be the person she wanted sitting on the porch with her, and the porch itself was evidence of a decade of steady improvement. It ran all the way around the house now, solid and level, with the cottonwood shade falling across it on summer afternoons, and there were chairs on it that had been made in Wichita and a table that Albert had built himself in the winter of 1883, and that showed every mark of being exactly what it was, which was a piece of furniture made by someone who was a better rancher than a furniture maker, but who had made the effort because the person he was making it for deserved effort. They sat on that porch on a September evening in 1888, the 10th anniversary of the day Alice had stood in front of Gerald Fitch's auction with her envelope and her list, and the air was the same warm September air it had been that morning, and the fields were the same amber color in the harvest light, and the creek could be heard if you listened for it, and the cottonwoods along its bank were 20 feet tall and solid. Albert said, 10 years. 10 years, Alice agreed. I want to know something, he said. Ask, she said. She was always prepared for his questions. That morning after the auction, he said, when I asked you what you saw in the ruined place, were you annoyed? I've wondered sometimes. A woman who's just bought land against everyone's advice and a stranger comes up and asks her to justify herself. Alice looked at the fields in the evening light. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. No, she said. You weren't asking me to justify anything. You were asking because you wanted to know. There's a difference, and I knew the difference from the first word you said. Albert nodded slowly. If you had come up to me and said, I hope you know what you're getting into, miss, the way 6 men said that exact thing to me in the following weeks, I would have given you the answer I gave them, which was polite and brief. But you asked what I saw, you asked what I was looking at. That wasn't a challenge, that was she stopped. What, he asked. That was the beginning of everything, she said. The same thing I told you on those courthouse steps. I meant it then and I mean it now. Albert reached over and took her hand, and they sat in the September evening watching the light go out of the sky over the Kansas plains. 332 acres of land they had built together from a caved-in roof, and a dry well, and a leaning barn, and 2 elderly goats, and 1 enterprising dog. Inside the house, Clara was talking to one of the chickens that had gotten into the kitchen. William was reading something by lamplight with the fierce concentration that was already his signature, and Robert was making some kind of construction in the corner that involved 3 chairs and the good blanket, as he had been asked not to do, but which he was doing anyway with the cheerful certainty of a child who trusted his parents' love enough to test its limits. Commissioner came around the corner of the porch and settled at Alice's feet with a sigh of profound contentment, and Alice reached down and scratched between his ears, and he thumped his tail against the porch boards. The stars were beginning to appear overhead in the deep blue of the September evening, the same stars that had been overhead on 100 porch evenings and 1,000 working days, and through 2 hard winters and the births of 3 children and 1 good argument, and the patient accumulation of everything that a life is made of when it is made with intention and honesty, and a willingness to ask what another person sees. Alice Underwood, née Slater, leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, and the September wind moved across the Kansas plains, and the farm was quiet around them, and everything that needed building had been built, and everything that needed resolving had been resolved, and everything that had been ruined had been made good. It was exactly where she had always meant to be. The cottonwoods she had planted in her first year on the property rustled in the evening air, and the creek ran over its stones in the dark below the bank, and the new well drew cold water from the limestone spring she had found by walking the land carefully and looking at it with the attention it deserved. The ruined homestead was not a ruin anymore. It had not been a ruin in a very long time. It was a home and a farm and a life, and it had all of it begun on a September morning in 1878 when a woman with a clear vision had been the only bidder on a place everyone else had given up on, and a man with honest eyes had been the only one who asked what she saw in it. She had seen everything, and she had been right.